They took my blanket in winter, whispering, "Let her freeze," as if cruelty would land softer if it arrived on tiptoe, as if the cold would be kinder because it was handed to me like a secret. And I lay there with my eyes closed, and my breath leaving little white ghosts in the air, pretending to sleep so I wouldn't have to watch their hands peel away the last warm thing that still smelled like cedar and a long-ago husband. I am 82. I live alone now, in a room above a seamstress, who keeps the door propped open with a brick painted to look like a strawberry. And from my window I can see the bodega, where they stack oranges into pyramids that always threaten to topple. And I keep a kettle on the 2-burner stove, like a small lighthouse, whose job is to say, "You're home," even when home is not much more than 4 walls, 1 good chair, and a nail by the door for my coat. I sleep under a deep wool throw the color of pond water at dusk, and every night I smooth it with the back of my hand the way a person smooths a grave, and then I tuck my feet in and listen to the radiators hum like old men in church. Before this, there was the big house with the whispering, the fine faucets that glittered like jewelry, and the thermostat that never rose above virtue. Because in that house, caring for an old woman was an exercise regimen of appearances, and restraint and warmth was budgeted like a luxury we hadn't earned. It was a place where I learned to move quietly so the floorboards wouldn't complain to the people who had decided my comfort was a moral hazard, a thing to be rationed, a lesson to be taught. I had a corner of the living room they called cozy, though it was planted in the path of the draft that slid under the back door, and a lamp with a soft yellow shade they said was good for eye health, though it made the room look like a waiting room for a doctor who never called your name, and a stack of magazines about perfect kitchens that smelled faintly of perfume. And it was there, on that frigid evening, when the glass of water on the side table grew a collar of ice like frostbite, jewelry, that I heard the steps in the hallway and the voice at the register tuned whisper, the voice that once asked me for lunch money and later for help with a mortgage, saying, "Take it. She's always hogging the heavy one," followed by the rustle of fabric and the hush of someone pretending that meanness is a form of tidiness. I would like to say I cried out, that I grabbed the blanket and fought like a woman in a movie, but what I did was hold perfectly still, the way I used to when my babies slept on my chest and any twitch might wake them. And instead of anger, I felt a kind of winter lucidity, a crystal clarity that said, "So this is the shape of my life as they imagine it, a shape that leaves no room for my warmth, my needs, my history, my ordinary human animal right to be warm, and under that clarity, the memory of a December long ago when the man I loved brought home the blanket from a roadside store and said, 'This is for the years when I can't be your fire.' And I laughed and told him not to be dramatic. And we slept that night under the weight of it, and it never once betrayed me until the night human hands lifted it away and turned me into a lesson about thrift. There is a special kind of humiliation reserved for the nearly invisible, a brand of shame that is applied with a smile and a spreadsheet, where kindness appears as a bullet point, and stinginess is called discipline, and it leaves you lying on a couch you bought with your widow's savings, listening to the heat click off and on in irregular beats like a heart with arrhythmia, and you wonder when exactly the word mother turned into line item, and whether you did this to yourself by surviving long enough to be inconvenient. I will not martyr myself with pretty lies. I was not always clever. I stayed too long out of habit and out of the old superstition that love is something you keep paying for, even when the service has been discontinued, and I learned to shrink as if smallness were a virtue, as if silence were the tax on protection. But that night, the cold told me a different gospel. The air smelled like metal and detergent. The room held its breath. Somewhere, a refrigerator snored. Frost began to lace the corners of the window, and the moon laid a flat palm of light across the rug like a mother testing for fever. And I tucked my hands into the sleeves of my cardigan and remembered the things I had paid for that no one remembered. The teeth straightened by installment and oatmeal, the fevers carried on my back from bathroom to bed, the shoes bought 2 sizes too big because money was thin and feet were greedy, the mortgage down payment written in my shaky widow's hand when grief still made beehives in my chest, the oil deliveries scheduled in my name because I was the one who knew the dates and spoke politely to the man at the depot, the winter coats hung on the back of chairs and the mitten strings threaded through small sleeves so no one would come home crying, the soup, the socks on the radiator, the decades of warmth I created without applause, and I realized that somewhere along the way I had agreed to be grateful for a corner, a lamp, a whisper, like a tenant in my own generosity. The bone-deep cold has a memory. It carries the marsh smell of childhood winters when the windows wept and we plugged the cracks with newspapers. And it carries the hospital corridors where I sat with a paper cup of coffee going skin on top, while a doctor spoke in a voice that sounded like a radio tuned between stations. And it carries the long nights after my husband died, when I learned how to sleep on a bed that felt like a raft in the dark ocean of the bedroom. And in each of those winters, I met my fear, and I bought it a coat. But that particular winter in the big house asked a different price. It asked that I sign away the right to be a mammal, to be a creature entitled to warmth as much as to prayer. And in the stillness after the blanket vanished, I understood that the next morning would be a hinge, that something would swing open or shut, and I would either step into the bright, unflattering daylight where people see you and you see yourself, or I would sink into a ritual of grateful shivering and call it family. I am 82, and I have learned that a room can be a kingdom if the door locks from the inside and the kettle sings when you turn the knob. And I have learned that memory is a better insulator than bitterness, though both will keep a person warm if you hold them close enough. In my little room above the seamstress, where the day begins with the sound of scissors kissing cloth and the soft gossip of thread through needle eyes, I drink my tea with honey because it feels like an apology to my throat. And I set the cup on a saucer with a hairline crack that runs like a river across a map. And I think of that night, and I do not feel ruined. I feel recorded, as if the ledger of my life finally has a neat column where the debits and credits have been written down in my own hand. When I pass the mirror on my way to the stairwell, I catch sight of the woman I am now, her hair like the inside of a dandelion, and her mouth still muttering recipes to ghosts. Her coat, the pond water throw translated into a garment. Her hands, no longer pleading, but enumerating, counting out bus fare and the price of oranges and the small luxuries that have become my daily revolution. And I tell her, quietly, but without tremble, that the cold did not make me smaller. It traced me truer. It showed me the borders of a life I had let be drawn by other people's pencils, and it made me walk to the window and put my palm against the glass until my heat left a print, proof to myself that I was still a creature of temperature, a body with claim to fire, and that the next chapter would begin not with a door slammed behind me by someone else, but with the soft scrape of my own key in a lock that belongs to me. If you're listening, somewhere between the whistle of a kettle and the gossip of a radiator, know this: the winter that tried to turn me into a cautionary tale ended up becoming my witness, and the whisper that told me to freeze taught me how to listen for my own voice under the crackle of ice, the long, patient vowel that says, enough. The act itself was almost laughably small, if you looked at it without feeling the air around it, without hearing the exact quality of the whisper, without knowing the history folded inside that single winter evening. But for me, it was the hinge where everything turned, the proof that all the little cruelties I had excused as stress or forgetfulness or bad timing were not accidents at all, but a deliberate posture toward me, toward my body, toward my existence. I had fallen asleep in the armchair that leaned too far back and squeaked if you shifted, a chair they called Grandma's spot, with an affectionate tone that carried the aftertaste of mockery, and I had pulled the heavy wool blanket over myself because the room was drafty and the vents had been closed hours ago, and I was dreaming of nothing in particular when I felt the air shift, the faintest tug at my shoulder, the slow slide of warmth leaving my body like a tide retreating. I kept my eyes shut, but I was awake instantly, my body stiff with that primal alarm you feel when someone tries to touch you without permission. And into the silence came the daughter-in-law's voice, low but not low enough, as if I were deaf, as if age had sealed my ears as tightly as they wished to seal my mouth, whispering, "Let her freeze. It will teach her to stop hogging the good one." A pause, then a hushed chuckle, and another voice agreeing, "She'll be fine. She doesn't need so much. Old people run cold anyway, don't they?" And then the weight of the blanket disappeared entirely, leaving me in the thin air of the living room with only my cardigan buttoned wrong across my chest. I heard the whisper of feet retreating, the door easing shut, and I realized I had just been demoted from a person to a lesson, a moral anecdote about thrift and discomfort. It was not about fabric or temperature. It was about hierarchy, about who deserved to feel safe and who did not, about who was allowed the comfort of continuity and who would be taught through subtraction. I kept lying still, breath measured, chest rising evenly, because something told me that if I flinched, if I opened my eyes and demanded what they were doing, the humiliation would be sharper, the rebuttal rehearsed. "Oh, you must have imagined it. Mom, we were just tidying up. Don't be dramatic. Don't start something." I knew that tone too well, so I lay as still as a corpse and listened to the house around me breathe, the refrigerator sighing, the clock tick spelling out each second like a small sentence, and I understood, with sudden clarity, that the cruelty had not arrived that night. It had been dripping slowly into my life for years, in the way they corrected me when I told stories to the children, in the way they rolled their eyes at the old songs I hummed, in the way they rationed out affection like breadcrumbs dropped behind them to keep me following. But the blanket was different. The blanket had belonged to my late husband, a gift from our first December together, something he had bought on a roadside with money he could not really spare, laughing at his own sentimentality as he said, for the years when I can't be your fire. And for decades, that blanket had been my portable hearth. To take it was not a practical matter. It was a symbolic theft, a declaration that his memory, my warmth, and my right to occupy space in that house were all negotiable, dispensable, too heavy to be justified in the economy of their lives. When I opened my eyes finally, the room looked different, though nothing had changed in it. The lamp still made its weak circle on the floor. The shadows still collected in the corners. The thermostat still sat at its righteous number on the wall, but I no longer believed I was part of it. I realized that the chair was not Grandma's spot. It was a staging area, a placeholder, a corner of convenience, a way to keep me contained and visible but not truly seen. I sat there for a while, arms folded across my chest, feeling the cold creep into my sleeves. And I thought of every night I had stayed quiet so as not to disturb their rhythm. Every meal I had prepared and watched them eat without acknowledgement. Every bill I had covered without mention. Every sigh I had swallowed because I didn't want to be trouble. The blanket had been the last physical acknowledgement that I carried something of my own into their house, a relic of a time before them. And in removing it, they had announced without words that my past and my comfort were unwelcome here. I did not cry. I did not even move for a long time. My anger was not theatrical. It was cold and precise, like the air wrapping itself tighter around my knees. I thought about how I had signed the checks for the heating oil deliveries, how my name was still on the account, how the supplier called me every autumn to confirm the schedule. I thought about how many times I had pulled money quietly from my savings to smooth over their expenses, how my thrift had kept their holidays glossy, how my sacrifices had been folded invisibly into the fabric of their lifestyle. And I saw it then, not as generosity, but as a contract I had signed without reading the fine print, a contract that apparently allowed them to ration me out like a child's dessert. That night, the removal of the blanket was not simply an insult. It was the catalyst that rewrote my understanding of my place in that house. I was not family in their eyes, not legacy, not elder deserving respect. I was a tenant of their tolerance, and tolerance is a thin quilt in the heart of winter. I sat there until the house settled into full silence, until even the pipes stopped clanking, until I knew no one would come back to return the blanket or check on me. And then I stood slowly, joints protesting, heart steady, and I walked barefoot into the hallway, past the photographs on the wall that showed their vacations, their smiling faces, their curated lives where I did not appear. And I reached out and touched one frame lightly, feeling the glass cold as ice. And I thought, you have. Erased me so cleanly you think I will not notice, but I noticed. I noticed in the emptiness where my blanket should have been, in the echo where my name used to be spoken with warmth, in the whisper that told me not to need what I had already earned. That was the moment, more than any argument, more than any slammed door, more than any insult, when I understood. They had chosen to let me freeze, and I would not oblige them twice. The days that followed the theft of my blanket did not explode into confrontation or drama, because families like mine do not operate with slamming doors or outright declarations. They operate with calibrations, with quiet reductions, with a system of rationing dignity until you are left with crumbs you are expected to thank them for. And so the escalation was not loud, but persistent. The kind of cruelty that arrives on tiptoe and settles in like a draft you cannot block. The thermostat in that house became a battlefield I was never invited to fight upon. They set it at a frugal number, and when I asked gently if it might be nudged higher, the daughter-in-law gave me a look of theatrical pity and said, Oh, Mary, we're really trying to save on energy. It's good for the environment, and you know older people should move around more. Keeps the circulation up, so just add another sweater. As if my body's shivering was not a message of need, but a moral failing. As if I were lazy for wanting warmth. I stopped asking after that first dismissal because I had already learned that questions become ammunition, that every plea will be transformed into proof that you are unreasonable. So instead, I layered myself with sweaters that still smelled faintly of mothballs, socks with thinning heels, and scarves folded twice around my neck, and yet the cold still seeped in, curling around my ankles, finding its way into my joints until my hands ached too much to button my blouse. I began spending more time in the kitchen, not because anyone wanted me there, but because when the oven was on, I could hover near it like a beggar near a campfire, opening the door a crack after baking potatoes just to let the heat leak into my face, though I made sure to close it quickly when I heard footsteps because I knew they would call it wasteful. Sometimes I would sit at the table with my tea, wrapping both hands around the mug until the liquid cooled to a skin, and I would listen to the sound of the children upstairs laughing into their devices, their little bodies warm in fleece pajamas, had bought last winter, while I pulled my cardigan tighter and told myself that a mother's job was never to envy her grandchildren, but envy arrived anyway, uninvited, every time I saw their rosy cheeks and bare feet on the wood floors. When meals were served, I noticed how I was given the smallest portion, not ungenerous but always measured, as if food too had become a controlled resource, as if I were a burden not just on space but on calories. I did not complain. I told myself that less food was easier on my digestion, that my appetite was smaller now, though in truth my stomach growled into the nights, loud enough to shame me. The cruelties were not limited to hunger and cold. There was a subtler form of erasure at play. My stories, once solicited, became interruptions. When I began to tell the children about the snowstorm of 1954, my son cut me off with a quick, "They don't need to hear about that, Mom. Let's not." Bore them, and the children's eyes already glazed over, trained to follow his cues. And I fell silent. At dinner, when a recipe reminded me of my late husband, Carla smiled with brittle politeness and said, "That was before my time, Mary. Let's focus on the present," as though memory itself were a trespass. Even my body was minimized. When I coughed, no one asked if I was well. They asked if I could take it to another room so the baby would not be disturbed. When I shuffled slowly to the bathroom, my son sighed audibly and said, "You should try to be quicker, Mom. We're always waiting for you." Though there was never a schedule that depended on me. In those weeks, I began to notice the shape of my existence shrinking. My corner chair became a kind of cage. They placed a basket beside it, filled with puzzles and knitting yarn, as if that corner were my designated playground. My movements outside that perimeter were met with raised eyebrows. If I lingered too long in the kitchen, I was in the way. If I stood too long at the window, I was asked if I was lost in thought again, the word lost carrying too much weight. And so I learned to fold myself into the smallest shapes, to become the kind of quiet background figure they preferred. And yet even then my presence seemed to trouble them, a reminder of mortality they could not polish away. The most painful part was not the hunger or the cold or even the silence imposed on my stories. It was the way they looked at me when they thought I wasn't watching. A glance of irritation, as though I were an unsightly piece of furniture they regretted buying but were too polite to throw out. I saw that glance most often from my daughter-in-law, her mouth pinched, her eyes quick to slide past me. She prided herself on being charitable, on organizing neighborhood drives, on sponsoring causes for the elderly. And yet, when confronted with actual aging in her living room, she recoiled as if it were a stain. My son did not look at me with disgust. His gaze was different. Guilty, impatient, the gaze of a man who wanted to believe he was dutiful, but resented the cost. So the escalation did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like frost on a window, slowly clouding over every corner until you could no longer see through, until your breath against the glass left only a small circle of clarity that faded instantly. I started waking in the middle of the night, shivering, my thin blanket curled tight around me, and I would remember the weight of the stolen one, how it had once felt like the arms of my husband, and I would whisper his name into the dark and feel nothing but the dry echo of air. My bones ached with more than arthritis. They ached with the knowledge that I had become invisible in the very house I had financed, that my name was on bills no one admitted I paid, that my years of labor and loyalty had been alchemized into an expectation that I would require nothing but silence and sweaters. One afternoon, when the house was empty, I wandered into the garage, hoping to find an old heater or extra bedding, but instead I found boxes labeled with Carla's handwriting, sharp and territorial. Seasonal decor, baby clothes, donate. On top of one box was a pile of my own things, sweaters I hadn't seen in months, my old teapot, the photo album I thought was lost. A sticky note said, "Yard sale," with a question mark, as though my memories were clutter to be priced and sold. I carried the photo album back to my room and tucked it under the mattress like contraband. That night, when I opened it, I saw my husband's smile, my children as small as sparrows, myself younger and unlined, and I realized with a sharp, undeniable clarity that erasure was not passive, it was active. It was being carried out box by box, whisper by whisper, until nothing of me would remain, but perhaps a chair labeled Grandma's spot after I was gone. And so the escalation was not a single dramatic act, but a daily discipline of diminishment. Each day they trimmed a little more from my presence. Each day they framed my needs as indulgences. Each day they nudged me closer to the role of an intruder in a house that had been built on my sacrifices. The cruelty was quiet, but it was cumulative, like snow that seems harmless until you realize it has collapsed the roof. And I knew, though I could not yet say it out loud, that the roof would soon fall unless I found a way to step outside, unless I remembered that invisibility is not the same as absence, and that the act of erasure can be reversed the moment you decide to write your name again. It was in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, when the house had emptied of its noise, and I could hear only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the wind rattling the bare branches outside, that the shift began, not with a confrontation, not with a sudden explosion of courage, but with the simplest of accidents, the kind of discovery that changes the way you see the furniture of your life. For while searching for a spare light bulb in the desk drawer where I thought my son kept household odds and ends, I found instead the folder from the heating oil company, the one with invoices neatly clipped together, and on the top page, in bold black letters, was my name, not his, not hers, but mine, printed clearly as the account holder. For a moment, I simply stared at the paper, as though I had stumbled across a relic from a life I once lived. Something sacred I had forgotten belonged to me. And then I felt it. That small tightening in the chest that was not fear this time, but recognition. Because here was proof that I was not the guest they treated me as, not the freeloader they hinted about, not the dependent they suggested I had become, but the one whose money had kept the furnace alive through all the winters, whose signature had ensured that the tank was filled, whose quiet sacrifices had quite literally kept the air warm in rooms where my voice was now unwelcome. I sat down in the chair by the desk, the invoices trembling slightly in my hands, not from weakness, but from a dawning awareness that everything I had been made to feel was a distortion, that the cold pressing into my bones at night was not inevitable, that the humiliation of being told to wear another sweater was not about finances or virtue, but about control. And for the first time in years, I let myself trace my own name on the page with the tip of my finger, as though reacquainting myself with a woman I had nearly forgotten. The letters curved strong and certain, not shaky, not fading, and I realized that somewhere inside me I still possessed the power to say yes or no, to pay or not pay, to decide who in this house froze and who did not. I slipped the folder back exactly as I had found it, careful not to leave any sign of disturbance, but the knowledge did not go back into the drawer. It lodged inside me like a coal, refusing to extinguish. That evening, when Carla breezed through the kitchen talking about a new budget plan and reminding me again to be mindful of hot water use, I nodded politely. But behind my calm eyes, I was already rearranging the ledger of my own life. I began to walk through the house differently, slower but more deliberate, touching surfaces, pausing at windows, as though to remind myself that these walls had been paid for with my years, that I was not a tolerated burden, but an unacknowledged benefactor. The photographs that excluded me no longer cut as deeply. Instead, I saw them for what they were, staged illusions in a house whose real foundation was invisible, but solid, because I had poured it myself. That night, in the silence of my corner chair, I pulled out an old notebook I had carried in my purse for years, its pages filled with shopping lists and reminders, and on a blank sheet I began to write. Not poetry, not letters, but numbers. I listed the dates of the oil payments, the amounts, the deposits from my account, the cash withdrawals I had made over the last 2 winters. I wrote them down with the meticulousness of a woman rebuilding her memory brick by brick. And when I looked at the totals, I smiled faintly. It was not just paper. It was leverage. It was history. It was proof that I had not vanished, no matter how carefully they cropped me out of the frame. I began to imagine possibilities, small at first, tentative, like the thought of skipping a transfer 1 month just to see what would happen, or calling the supplier myself and changing the delivery date. These were not actions yet, only rehearsals in my mind. But the mere act of imagining them was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I was not rehearsing apologies. I was rehearsing choices. When I wrapped myself in the thin blanket that night, I no longer felt only the cold. I felt the quiet hum of potential, like a song beginning far off in the distance. It was also around this time that I started carrying myself differently in conversation, though they did not notice. When my son lectured me gently about the cost of groceries, I did not shrink or explain. I simply looked at him with a level gaze that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. When Carla mentioned how hard it is to manage everything these days, I thought, but did not say, "You have never managed half of what I did," and that unspoken sentence gave me strength. I no longer needed their validation for my reality. The invoices had validated me already. The true shift, though, was internal, quiet but seismic. For years, I had believed their version of me, the diminished silhouette they preferred, the woman grateful for scraps of space and leftover heat. But sitting at the desk that Tuesday, tracing my name, I remembered with startling clarity the woman I had been before, resourceful, stubborn, the one who made do with little but always made sure there was enough for others, the one who had signed mortgages and contracts, the one who had stood at gravesides and still kept going. She was not gone. She was only buried under the snow of their contempt, and with the discovery of that folder, I felt her thawing, stretching her limbs, readying herself to stand. From that day on, the house did not feel like a prison so much as a stage where I was biding my time. Every dismissive comment, every whisper, every rationing of heat became fuel rather than defeat, because I knew something they did not. The accounts were mine. The payments were mine. The choice was mine. I had begun to remember that my life was not over simply because they had written me out of theirs. The shift was subtle, invisible to them, but enormous to me, because for the first time in years I was not waiting to be rescued or validated. I was preparing quietly, steadily, to rescue myself. I did the smallest thing first, because that is how a woman who has lived through long winters begins a revolution. Not with a shout, but with a fingertip on a switch. And so I opened my old notebook to the page where I had written the dates of the oil deliveries and the bank transfer that left my account as obediently as a well-trained dog, and I called the number printed at the top of the invoice and spoke in the calm voice I used to use with doctors and loan officers and anyone else who assumed gray hair meant confusion, and I said that I, the account holder whose name you can see there in bold, would like to place a temporary hold on automatic payments and delay the next fill until I review consumption, and the woman on the line, who sounded as tired as January, said, "Of course, Mrs., we can do that." And she read back my name carefully, and I repeated it more carefully still, as if saying it aloud might lay a claim on my own life again. The next morning, the thermostat felt different even before I touched it. Not because the house was warmer, it was not, but because the cold had become honest. No longer a test I was failing, but weather I was measuring. The tank gauge in the basement showed a shallow crescent where there used to be a solid moon, and when Carla opened the hall closet to pull out a scarf and muttered that the place felt chilly and that the supplier must be slacking because she could have sworn a delivery was due, I stood at the kettle, waiting for the thin ribbon of steam, and I said mildly that sometimes companies move too fast, and sometimes they move too slow, and sometimes it's better to check the bill before you preach about sweaters, and she stared at me as if I had spoken an unfamiliar language, because I had spoken in the grammar of possession, and she had never learned that tense from me. It took exactly 2 days for my son to smell the change like smoke. He came home early on a Thursday, still wearing the face he saves for meetings, and he waited until the children were out of the room and Carla was clattering dishes in the sink. Then he leaned one hip against the counter and asked, in that clipped voice he uses when he's trying very hard to be kind to a person he has already decided is wrong, whether I had perhaps touched something I shouldn't, maybe the bank app or the thermostat schedule, because he'd just received a notice that the oil billing had been altered, and now there was a hold, and could I help him understand why that might be? I looked at his hands, smooth, restless, the same hands that once clutched a feverish blanket while I sat on the bathroom floor counting his breaths, and I said that the oil account is in my name, that the money that fed the tank came from me, that I am reviewing the spending because my bones are not a charity box and my body is not a lesson, and his whole face rearranged itself as if a mask had tightened, and he said softly, carefully, the way an adult speaks to a child standing too close to traffic, that he was worried I might be getting confused by the complexity of things, that maybe it was time for him to take over those little burdens, that it was so much easier for everyone if he could centralize all the accounts. And I realized the centralization he imagined was a noose. I reminded him, gently enough to bruise, that I successfully paid for the winters that carried him through boyhood and grief, that I had navigated interest rates and hospital bills, that I had kept the soup hot and the roof patched without applause, and that it was insulting to pretend I had forgotten the alphabet of a bill, and he winced, not because I had hit him, but because I had removed the pillow of my usual softness, and then the doorbell rang and spared him the next line of his argument. It was destiny's joke that an oil truck arrived right then, backing into the driveway with its reverse beep puncturing the quiet, and Carla, who is allergic to public embarrassment, hurried to the door with a smile already stapled to her face, only to find the driver walking up the path with a clipboard and an apologetic shrug, explaining that he had been routed automatically, but the office had a hold on the account, and he couldn't pump a drop without the account holder's release. And I watched. Her glance over her shoulder at me before she turned the full heat of her politeness on the man, offering him coffee, asking whether there was perhaps a mistake, and when he repeated, account holder, I could almost see the shape of those words, entering the house like a stray animal, and I stepped forward and said, thank you for coming. I'm reviewing the schedule. No delivery today. Please note that on the log. And he tipped his cap and left the long hose coiled like a black snake on the walk, and the neighbors, with their talent for hearing through glass, peered between their tasteful curtains, and Carla shut the door very carefully, as if noisy motion might cause the whole facade to shatter. The conversation that followed passed for civil, because everything in that house did, but the temperature in the room dropped like a barometer before a storm. She asked what exactly I thought I was doing. I said that I was setting a boundary with money. She said that boundaries were fine in theory, but could we please be practical? We have a baby. We have guests. We have appearances. And I said, so do I. And the only appearance that concerns me is the one in the mirror when I ask the woman there why she always pays to be humiliated. My son tried another tactic, the velvet rope of guilt. He spoke of the children and their delicate lungs, of the pipes that could burst if the house cooled, of the financial penalties of emergency deliveries, of the way responsible people plan ahead. And I said, responsible people do not steal blankets from old women and call it thrift. Responsible people do not hide the hands that feed them and then try to cuff those hands the minute they stop spooning. And responsible people do not confuse their comfort with my duty. By evening, my folder had disappeared from the desk drawer, which told me they had finally understood that paper is power. And when I went to my room, I found my drawers tidied beyond recognition, my pillbox relocated to the top of the dresser for safety, my spare keys missing from the dish by the lamp, and an informational brochure for an assisted living community with boutique amenities folded like an invitation on my pillow, which would have been funny if it were not a threat, because I know the choreography of such transitions. First, they reposition your belongings. Then they reposition your language. Then they reposition your address. I took the brochure to the kitchen and unfolded it like a white flag, because I wanted them to see it in my hands, and I said, I am not a guest you can check out of your life. I am not a suitcase you can store in a facility between vacations. And my son said, with that soft male authority that makes nurses clench their jaws, that no one was talking about moving me. This was only information, and it would be irresponsible not to think ahead, given my age and my recent odd choices. And this time, I laughed, not loud, not cruel, but with the kind of surprised delight that attends an epiphany, because his language betrayed him. He had said my age and my choices in a sentence whose subject was really his comfort, and he didn't even hear it. I slept with my purse under my pillow that night, the way a woman does when she has begun to value proof more than rest. And before dawn, I walked to the bank while the neighborhood was still stretching, and I told the teller to remove the automatic. Transfer to the oil company to require my voice for any changes, to mail paper statements to a P.O. box. I set up that morning, and as I signed my name over and over, I watched my hand grow steadier with each signature, as if repetition were exercise, and the muscle of self-possession was remembering its strength. Pressure always finds new doors, and by the weekend, a wellness check arrived in the form of a woman with a clipboard and a smile that had been trained to look like concern. She introduced herself as someone from a community agency who had received a call from a family member worried about an elder refusing essential services, and my son hovered nearby, pretending to be ashamed of having to involve outsiders, while he made furious eye contact with me over the agent's shoulder. And I invited her to sit, and I boiled water, and I asked her how she took her tea, and then I told her, in sentences as long and careful as contracts, that I was of sound mind and perfectly capable of making decisions about my money, that I had placed a hold on a non-essential delivery because the current tank level was adequate in this weather, that I had paid every invoice for years without complaint, that my body had been humiliated in ways that did not need documentation, but which I could detail if she insisted, and that I would be happy to sign any form affirming my competence as long as my son also signed a statement, acknowledging that the account in question was mine, and the clipboard woman, being smarter than she looked, took in the narrow tremor of Carla's mouth and the bright flush on my son's neck and the neat stack of invoices I had laid on the table like a deck of cards, and she said, quietly, that she saw no cause for intervention, and I walked her to the door and watched the relief and anger battle on my son's face like wind and flame. The past came back in odd shapes during those days, not as nostalgia, but as a stern instructor. My mother's kitchen returned to me with its cracked linoleum and its oven door wedged with a wooden spoon to keep the heat from leaking, and I remembered how she used to say that cold teaches you who you are because it strips away all the adjectives, and I remembered the part of me that had learned thrift without cruelty, firmness without spectacle, and I decided that I would not let their frugality masquerade as virtue when it was, in fact, punishment. My grandson texted once, a message clearly typed with his thumbs while his parents argued in the background, asking if I was okay and whether I had broken the heating on purpose, and could I please not make everyone sick. And I wrote back, after a long pause in which I breathed the way midwives taught me decades ago, that I was safe and warm enough, that houses can be made safe with mittens and decency, and that sometimes the only way to teach people to stop taking your warmth is to stop paying for the fire that fuels their cruelty. And he sent a heart and nothing else, which told me he understood more than the adults allowed. Carla, who needs public approval the way some people need salt, took her battle to the neighborhood app, where people who live in pristine houses ask if anyone has a recommendation for a humane exterminator or a discreet handyman, and she posted a soft-focus plea about an elderly relative who had become paranoid about heating bills and was putting the household at risk, and did anyone know a compassionate geriatric specialist or legal advisor. And she thought she had been clever because she never wrote my name, but a woman on the next street who once borrowed my rolling pin and never returned it sent me a screenshot with 3 words, "Is this you?" And a string of boiling indignation rose in me, not at the gossip, but at the way my life had been converted into content. I did not answer the post because I do not argue with ghosts, but the next morning I placed another call, this time to the oil company's billing office, where a man with a smoker's voice confirmed what the woman had told me before, that the account was mine and any credits or prepaid amounts were movable at my direction. And he explained almost apologetically that if I wished, I could opt out of the preferred customer plan and liquidate the balance at the current buyback rate. And the phrase, "the buyback rate," sat in my ear like a bell about to be struck, and I thanked him and said I would consider it, because I had learned long ago not to marry an idea the minute it winks at you, even if it is very handsome. The pressure at home continued like a weather system that refuses to move off the coast, gray and low and damp, and they tried new tactics, more medical appointments, more pamphlets left where my eyes would land, more little invasions disguised as help, like pre-filling my pill box wrong and then correcting me when I fixed it, or replacing my kettle with an electric one for safety, and then scolding me for not using it as if habit were a crime, and at every turn I refused to be provoked into. The shrillness that would prove their point. I spoke in a register so calm it frightened even me. And sometimes late at night, when the house exhaled and softened, and I could hear the baby sigh in sleep, I felt the old ache that makes a woman give, in just to stop the noise. But then I would place my palm against the wall and feel the cold sneak through the paint, and I would remember that my body lives here and deserves allegiance before anyone's comfort does, and I would go to the notebook and write another small instruction to myself. Keep your receipts, drink water, wait. They tried once to change the lock on the basement door after I had been seen down there studying the tank gauge, claiming safety concerns and liability, and I sat with my hands folded while the handyman worked. And when he left, I called the company and asked the price of a replacement lock that accepted my key as well. And I paid for it myself and gave the handyman a sandwich and a look that said, "A woman's patience is not the same as her permission." And I kept my new key on a ribbon that I wore, under my shirt like a Saint medal. When my son finally said the word guardianship, not loudly, not even as a threat, more as a question that wanted to see how it tasted in the air, I did not rise or cry. I said that any such move would compel me to publish a short ledger of my contributions over the past 10 years, including but not limited to down payments and tuition and groceries and 2 winters of heat paid in full, and I would send copies to whichever court or congregation he preferred. And he flinched again and said I was being dramatic, and I answered that I had been silent so long that my honesty sounded like theater to people who preferred a quieter lie. In those days, the house began to reveal its seams to me, the way certain boards complained when crossed, the way the front door stuck on humid mornings, the way the cold pooled near the staircase. And I moved through it like a surveyor reclaiming a stolen plot, marking corners in my mind, measuring distances between what they said and what was true, and every measurement made the air feel clearer, even if the temperature did not rise. I started to carry a small envelope of cash in the lining of my coat, not because I was running away, though part of me was already stepping out, but because money transforms a woman from furniture into a person, and I intended never again to be moved without my consent. The second escalation, if that grand name can be given to a series of small decisions made over lukewarm tea, was simply this. I refused every story they told about me. I refused the title of dependent. I refused the role of grateful, cold thing in the corner. I refused the insinuations draped like shawls over my shoulders, and I held in my hand the only proof I needed, that my name, intact and legible, sat at the top of the paper that controlled the fire, and I could, at a time of my choosing, turn that paper into tinder for my own escape. On the last night before everything changed, the wind blew hard enough to rattle the glass in their beautiful frames, and I lay awake, listening to the house complain and to the rustle of people in rooms they took for granted. And I thought of the roadside store where my husband bought the blanket that used to be mine, the old man behind the counter who wrapped it in brown paper and said to my husband, "She'll keep this longer than she keeps you," meaning that wool outlives breath. And I smiled in the dark because the old man had been both right and wrong. The wool had outlived my husband, but I had outlived the theft of it. And at dawn, when the light came up like a pale coin and the neighbor's dog began his regular complaints, I reached for my purse and my folder and the note I had written to myself in large, unrushed letters. Tomorrow, call the depot, ask for buyback, buy your own warmth, buy your own door. And I sat there, listening to the kettle that I had kept. The last faithful thing in a house full of borrowed mercy. And I knew with a steadiness that felt like a coat finally buttoned to the throat that the test was over and the proof was sufficient, and that the next thing I did would not be a plea or a negotiation, but an action, simple and irreversible, like selling a winter back to the people who made it. The decision itself was not made in a rush or in anger. It was made in the quiet space between one teacup and another, in the moment when I finally admitted to myself that there was no return, no conversation that would soften what had already been, carved into the stone of our lives. They had played their part, letters that rewrote history, newspaper articles painting me as vulnerable and lost, lawyers arriving in tailored suits to dress control up as concern, and I had played mine, answering with silence, with measured refusals, with the careful gathering of proof. But there comes a point where refusal is not enough, where simply holding your ground is indistinguishable from standing still, and I did not survive 8 decades only to be frozen like a museum piece in someone else's display. So I acted. The letter to the lawyer was my first strike, neat and cold as winter sun. I wrote that I was of sound mind, living independently, that any further attempts to intervene under the guise of guardianship would be treated as harassment, and I signed it with the same hand that once signed mortgage checks and field trip. Permissions, steady, legible, undeniable. I mailed it with a strange calm, the kind of calm that comes when you finally stop rehearsing excuses. The act was not dramatic, but it was irreversible. With that letter, I cut the final thread by which they thought they still held me. The second act was quieter still, almost tender. I went to the bank and asked to liquidate the remaining credits on the oil account, the one that had been my tether to their house. The invisible umbilical cord they had assumed would always pump warmth into their carefully curated lives. The clerk hesitated, then confirmed again that the account was mine, that the balance could be returned in full. I signed the form, watched the numbers shift from their ledger into mine, and felt the strangest sense of relief, as if I had finally taken my blanket back, not in fabric, but in fact. That money, modest but real, I transferred not to myself, but to Kieran. He had not asked. He would never ask. But I wanted him to know that someone in his bloodline believed in giving, not controlling. I left no instructions, no demands, just a gift, no strings, no shame, no ledger to balance. That was the truest rebellion. Money without control, love without demand. But the true climax came not with papers or transfers, but with words. Few words, sharp as a blade. Lisa arrived in her polished coat, carrying her exhaustion like a purse she did not know how to set down, and she tried, almost sincerely, to explain, to frame the abandonment as confusion, the cruelty as accident. And I listened, not with rage, but with the steady patience of a woman who has finally stopped bargaining. When she admitted quietly that she had never wanted my shadow in every room, I felt something in me loosen, because at last there was truth, raw and unadorned. I told her then, in the voice that once sang lullabies and later buried her husband, that I was not her shadow, never her shadow, that I was my own person, and that I had remembered it too late for her comfort, but not too late for my survival. I watched her shrink in the booth across from me, manicured hands folded like origami she could not unfold, and I knew then that there was no going back, not for either of us. That night, I wrote 2 letters, one to Lisa, brief and final. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I am not angry. I am not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I finally started mine. It was not a curse, not a plea, but a declaration, a closing of the door from my side. The other was to myself, scribbled on the back of a recipe card in my old box. You are not a burden. You are not a guest. You are the keeper of your own fire. I tucked it behind the lemon square recipe so that one day, if my memory falters, my own hand will remind me. The irreversible act was not spite. It was clarity. When I posted the letter to Lisa, when I dropped the legal notice in the box, when I signed away the oil account, I did not feel vengeful. I felt light, as though every year of silence and cold had been bricks in a bag I finally set down. I stood on the porch with Joyce that evening, the air damp with the smell of wood smoke, and when she asked what I had done, I only said, I ended it. She didn't press. She just raised her mug of wine and said, to endings that taste like beginnings. And that was it. The door closed, not with a slam, but with a sigh. The woman they had tried to freeze had sold their fire, mailed their names back to them in ink, and walked into a life where her warmth was her own. There is no reconciliation in this story, no return, no stage-managed forgiveness. There is only the act of cutting the rope and feeling, for the first time in years, the weight lift from your shoulders, leaving you standing taller than you thought you could. I live now in a room that is mine, in a way no grand house ever was. A narrow place above a bakery where the scent of yeast and sugar rises through the floorboards and seeps into my sleep. And when I open the window in the morning, the air is sharp, but honest. Not the kind of cold designed to punish me, but the simple cold of the world. A weather I choose to meet, My blanket, the new one I bought with money they never knew I had, lies folded at the foot of my bed like a patient animal, waiting each night to wrap itself around me. And every time I smooth its edges, I remember the night they stole the old one and whispered that I should freeze. And I smile because I did not freeze. I burned quietly until I turned their own fire into my freedom. I keep the kettle polished and loyal, and its whistle feels like a hymn written only for me, proof that some things still sing when you tend them with respect. My days are not grand, but they are steady. Tea in the morning, a walk to the park where pigeons scatter at my steps, an hour at the library where the young woman behind the desk greets me by name without needing to be reminded. No one here sighs when I enter a room. No one calculates the cost of my warmth. No one measures out my portions or edits my stories. Here I am, simply an old woman living, and that is enough. I sometimes think of them, not with venom, but with a kind of distant pity, because they are trapped still in the house I left, a house colder than they will admit, not because the furnace runs low, but because their hearts are locked in the constant arithmetic of control, and there is no fire in that equation. I know they tell the neighbors I am stubborn, perhaps even unwell, that I chose to leave, as though independence were a diagnosis. But I no longer correct the narrative, because the truth needs no witness but me. What I hold is not anger, but a record, a private ledger of years of silence, and the moment I stopped paying into it. And that ledger balances cleanly now. There are evenings when I sit by the window with a cup of broth, and the light falls just so across the rooftops, and I hear my husband's voice in memory, the old line about being my fire, and I whisper back, half a laugh in my throat, that I have learned to strike my own match. What surprises me most is not the relief, but the absence of loneliness. I had feared all those nights in the big house that if I left I would be swallowed by emptiness, that the absence of family would echo louder than the silence of their contempt. But it turns out the heart adjusts quickly to solitude, when that solitude is not punishment, but choice. I have found companionship in small things. The baker's boy who saves me a roll at the end of the day, the neighbor who knocks on my door with leftover soup, the librarian who sets aside novels she thinks I might like. These gestures are not grand, but they are free of cruelty, and they warm more reliably than any radiator. I do not tell this story to shame them, nor do I tell it to make myself a heroine. I tell it because there are women, perhaps even you, listening to this voice in your own mind, who sit in corners of houses they paid for, under blankets that are rationed or removed, shrinking each day to fit the outline someone else has drawn. And I want them to know that erasure is not the final chapter. The world will try to convince you that your silence is safety, that your gratitude is duty, that your cold is virtue. But there comes a moment, as it came for me, when you see your name written clearly on the ledger of your own life, and you understand that you still own more than they would have you believe. When that moment comes, do not be afraid of the door. Do not be afraid of the cold outside. The real cold is the kind that seeps into your bones when you are denied dignity. And the real warmth is the kind you make when you decide, even at 80, to choose yourself. I sit now with my blanket tucked around my knees, pen in hand, kettle singing low, and I feel no need for reconciliation or spectacle. I am not frozen. I am not erased. I am not waiting. I am here, present and whole, warmed by my own fire. And if I could send one message back through the winters of my life, it would be this: when they take your blanket, sell their fire. When they whisper, let her freeze. Answer not with a plea, but with an act. The act will be small, perhaps only a signature or a phone call, but it will be yours, and from that moment on, the warmth you carry will never belong to anyone but you.